Good afternoon, and welcome to the final Medical Center Hour for the 2009-2010 season. My name is Joan Echtenkamp-Pine. I'm the Curator for Historical Collections in the Health Sciences Library, and we are co-sponsoring today's talk. Before I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Marge Crispell. We at the library are pleased to honor Ken Crispell's memory with an annual lecture on the history of the health sciences. Dr. Crispell was a good friend of the library. He played a major role in getting the funding that enabled the current library to be built and with modernized and expanded library facilities and services. Dr. Crispell's vision for the Health Sciences Library was an integral part of the health system, a place for students and faculty to find the information they needed in a facility that welcomed them and provided both ambiance and essential services. Ken Crispell's farsightedness helped carry the Health Sciences Library into the 21st century. Dr. Crispell, an endocrinologist, began at UVA as an instructor in internal medicine in the Department of Medicine in 1948. He became Dean of the School of Medicine in 1964 and served in this capacity through 1971, when he became Vice President for Health Affairs. Under his leadership, the School of Medicine grew, both in terms of physical buildings and excellent faculty and programs. Building on his research interests, Dr. Crispell founded the UVA Law and Medicine program. Dr. Crispell provided a valuable perspective on history in the making and its legacy today and for the future. Today's talk, Normal at Any Cost, Tall Girls, Short Boys, and the Medical Manipulation of Height. We bring two wonderful speakers, author of the book that you see up on the screen, which there's information and some reviews on the back of your handout for ordering, and I encourage you to do so because it's wonderful. Human height is an inherited biological trait with strong social meaning in most cultures. In the United States, recent research shows a continuing positive correlation between above average height and happiness, greater educational achievement, higher economic status, and less of a tendency to worry. While below average height is associated with significant personal discontent. While studies have found this to be especially true for men, the picture has been less clear for women, for whom above average height has often been socially problematic. A generation ago, starting in the 1960s, concerns over the social, economic, and moral stigmatization of very short men and very tall women prompted well-meaning families and singularly well-intentioned doctors to medically treat their children whose predicted adult height was dramatically abnormal and thus might keep them from fitting in. At academic medical centers around the country, including at Johns Hopkins and here at UVA, short boys received human growth hormone to stimulate growth. Tall girls were given estrogens to induce early puberty and to stunt growth. The history of treating height has been called a perfect allegory for modern medicine. The story of scientific and medical achievement raises questions about the lines between experiment and treatment and enhancement. Questions about informed consent, medicalization of social problems, how we define what is normal, and the influence on our lives and in our lives of the pharmaceutical industry. This Medical Center Hour, with medical journalist Susan Cohen to my near right and Christine Cosgrove to the far right, and their full biographies are in here, so I encourage you to read that on your handout too. Medical journalists Sue and Chris explores the complicated intersection of medicine, society, and business that is the medical manipulation of height. The checkered, sometimes miraculous, sometimes tragic history of past efforts, as well as forecasts for future management of this part of our genetic makeup. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joan. We're honored to be here to speak. And when we were invited, we did ask whether Joan and Marcia knew that we're journalists rather than MDs, because we don't want to be accused of practicing medicine without a license. So here we are practicing history without a license instead. History is right up a journalist's alley because it's a story. And what Chris and I have done over many years of reporting and writing is to tell the story, decade by decade, of the way in which medicine has been used to attempt to boost or stunt height. We thought this history was compelling, but we also saw in it a cautionary tale for the future when people have the ability, or we believe we do, to modify other inherited characteristics. As Joan mentioned, the history is also an allegory, a kind of a case study of the way medicine is practiced today, when cures for disease evolve at ever quicker paces into treatments for disability, then disadvantage, then to satisfy the desire for perfection. Ever since surgeon Harvey Cushing theorized in the early 1900s, wrong slide, that the pituitary gland produces a substance that regulates growth, there's been a tremendous interest in harvesting and harnessing this hormone. It was an era of organotherapy, when drug companies marketed cocktails of organic substances and early endocrinologists prescribed them for everything from vague malaise to impotence. Cushing worried about quackery and about what he warned might turn out to be an unseemly rush by doctors to use growth hormone once it could be isolated. He predicted this temptation to mine what he called the endocrine gold fields by a specialty that he satirized as believing in glandward hoe. This is just one of his warnings. The Lewis Carroll of today would have Alice nibble from a pituitary mushroom in her left hand and a lutein one in her right, and presto, she is any height desired. Amazingly, this was about 1921 when he made this prediction. Cushing needn't have worried immediately because it took years to isolate and extract growth hormone, first in animals and then in humans, and even then doctors couldn't seem to make anyone grow taller. It turned out that growth hormone is species specific. It wasn't until 1958, and after decades of injecting kids with extracts from cows, that Dr. Maurice Rabin at Tufts was able to make a teenage patient grow by giving him hormone derived from pituitary glands, humans. The boy was what would have been called at the time a midget, a hypopituitary dwarf. His own body did not produce enough growth hormone to get him even to 5 feet tall. Many of the munchkins in the Wizard of Oz movie in the 1930s had this same growth deficiency. There was tremendous excitement that children with this condition could be brought to normal height, and the use of growth hormone in classic cases of deficiency remains uncontroversial today, especially because growth hormone affects many other body processes besides linear growth. Families are profoundly grateful for the medical intervention, and pediatric endocrinologists find immense satisfaction in seeing this therapy work. But there was also immediate speculation that the same therapy might make any child grow taller, including those diagnosed with constitutional delay, what most of us call late bloomers, and familial short stature, that is, kids from short families, and those short for no known reason, who were typically described as short normal, meaning their hormone levels measured normal, yet they stood in the lowest percentiles in height. In the early 1960s, the federal government established a program under the auspices of the National Institutes of Health to increase and control the scarce supply of pituitary human growth hormone. Dr. Robert Blizzard, who's here today and who recently retired from UVA, was absolutely pivotal in launching this effort. Patients received growth hormone for free until they reached a certain height, originally 5 feet for boys and shorter than that for girls. And over the 22 years it operated, this agency added some 11 miles, if I'm correct, in height. Though human growth hormone, or HGH, was in extremely short supply, it was also used experimentally to see whether or not it could add adult height in cases where a child was not growth hormone deficient. The pituitary agency's heroic effort came to a tragic end. In 1985, a family in California noticed that their 20-year-old son was walking with an altered gait and complaining of dizziness. Joey Rodriguez became the first documented case of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or CJD, in someone who had been treated with pituitary human growth hormone as a child. The disease was not only extremely rare, but had been seen almost exclusively in the elderly. This is the first and most important lesson from the history of treating height, that even the most caring physicians and families can unintentionally do harm. At this point, more than 200 people who were given cadaver-derived growth hormone as children are known to have died worldwide of CJD, a disease that, as many of you know, is invariably fatal and can sit undetected in the brain for decades. Thousands have lived since 1985 knowing this threat is hanging over their lives with no way to test for it before symptoms appear. Pediatric endocrinologists we interviewed described this as the most terrible experience of their medical careers, having to sit down with a list of families and phone to say that doctors might have infected a child. The question in many countries that also have pituitary programs has been, did physicians ignore the risk, which seemed theoretical and so small, in their enthusiasm to help patients build careers and work miracles? In the United Kingdom, there was a civil trial, and the judge ruled that pediatric endocrinologists there had never been informed of the risk, but that the National Health Service should have known by 1977 that CJD was a possibility. The attorney who represented the British families noted, "We never know as much as we think we do." Another lesson for the genetic age of medicine. In Australia, a law professor assigned to investigate concluded, "It is important to establish the boundaries between treatment and experiment, even if those lines are blurry, as they are most often with new technologies." This tragedy spurred the FDA to approve genetically engineered recombinant human growth hormone. At the time, there were a few thousand children a year diagnosed with hypopituitary dwarfism, which is now more commonly called growth hormone deficiency. So Genentech's product, which won this approval, was also given orphan drug status. Yet, it was the product that launched the biotechnology industry. How? Immediately, Genentech set out to expand the market, first by redefining normal levels of growth hormone. In 1984, a company vice president put it that the country would see, quote, "the supply of growth hormone defining what the deficiency is. It's an evolving definition." For the first time, the world had as much human growth hormone as anyone wanted and could pay for. Genentech was clear at the time that they hoped ultimately to treat kids who were short for any reason. A marketing man there said, quote, "The dilemma then becomes not so much for us as for the physician." Pediatric endocrinologists did begin to wrestle at their meetings with the issues that were raised. They asked questions about the lines between treatment and enhancement, about informed consent, and whether the interests of parents and children are always the same, about how awful it is to be short, about the psychological impact of making a child feel he or she needed to be fixed, and the potential disappointment if years of injections didn't increase height. Some questioned the social justice of allowing families to pay more than $50,000 an inch in an attempt to make their children taller when other families couldn't afford medical care. But it was up to individual doctors to decide, and many of them argued that if they didn't treat, families would simply find another physician who would. A study found that pediatric endocrinologists were influenced by cultural factors in these decisions, including their perceptions of how much short boys and men suffered and how hard a family pushed them for treatment. Psychological studies, in fact, have found that being extremely short does not condemn a child to psychiatric illness. Studies of short children done in the community rather than of short kids who have been brought by their families to clinics, find they are teased more and that many of them would like to be taller, but that they adapt as a group, that they are not any more psychologically disturbed and they are not any less likely to be able to make friends. Studies of children who are given growth hormone therapy have not found it resulted in any improved quality of life, even though many families believe that it has. Yet there is the persistent belief that it is tragic to be a short boy, and industry has exploited this belief. The company did this not by advertising to the public, but by influencing physicians and encouraging doctors to prescribe off-label to healthy short children, a practice that later resulted in large criminal fines for both Genentech and Pfizer Pharmacia. In the late 1990s, when a survey of physician practices was taken, almost half the children receiving growth hormone therapy in this country received it for an unapproved use. It's important to remember that as this market was booming, medicine did not know whether or not giving additional growth hormone to children with normal levels actually increased adult height or only made kids grow faster. Growth hormone appeared to be mostly safe in the short term, but no one knew about 20 or 30 years later, especially given the shortened life expectancy of people with acromegaly, the condition in which the pituitary gland produces too much growth hormone. There were and continue to be those physicians who worry about the possibility of increased cancers and diabetes in the long term. So this is another lesson. New technologies get used even before there is what was already widespread practice when it added another indication approving HGH for non-deficient kids with no other conditions, that is, kids who are basically just statistically short. They did this based on a pivotal study that showed the average height gain was 1.5 to 2 inches. Height prediction, by the way, has a margin of error of plus or minus 2 inches. There is also no way to predict which child will gain a lot, a little, or nothing from years of injections. The two criteria are that children be in the lowest 1.2 percentile, although many doctors will treat taller kids as well, and that they are predicted not to reach normal range of height. At the time, that was considered to be about the bottom of the normal range for a U.S. man was considered to be about 5'3". Since then, I've seen journal articles that put that normal height at 5'4" or even 5'5". So once again, normal is being redefined. The same journals that used to call these kids short normal now call them short but otherwise healthy. The FDA staff predicted 1 million to 1.7 million kids might ultimately qualify for treatment based on this criteria. And because there will always be a shortest 1.2%, it is a never-ending market. If large numbers of the shortest children were made taller with growth hormone, others standing just above them on the charts would automatically sink to the lowest percentiles. Some doctors have pointed out that this might be the first time that some children will be defined as sick simply by making other children better. There are new treatments, even less proven as well, recombinant IGF-1, drugs to delay puberty, or to block estrogen and artificially keep the growth plates open. An increasing number of late bloomers are treated, and the most recent estimate I saw had reached more than $70,000 an inch. The long-term risks remain unknown, as does the answer to the bottom line question, how much risk is justified when the patient is a healthy child? Over and over, the best and worst motives have combined. The concerns of parents and children, the desires of doctors to help and to discover, and the potential huge profits of industry. There have been few incentives, on the other hand, to follow up what happened to these children once they became adults. And that is another lesson for the future. Without follow-up, there can be no good information to guide families or physicians weighing risks and benefits. A few times in this history, the patients have demanded answers as adults about the drugs they were given as children. That's what happened with some of the tall girls, and that's what Chris will talk about now.
Well, what happened to the tall girl certainly has many parallels to the story of treating short kids, mostly boys. But before I begin the story of these tall girls, total disclosure here, I should mention that I'm one of the thousands in the US who received huge doses of synthetic estrogens as a young teen to stunt my growth. Some people might argue it didn't work. Many of those I've talked to, like myself, have wondered for years what the impact of that treatment has had on their health. How did the practice of treating healthy girls with hormones come about? In our history of treating height, the stories of parents who feared their girls would grow too tall to find a mate and to have happy lives intersected with both a drug, DES, and then with certain cultural beliefs, which over time changed. How many of you are familiar with DES, or diethylstilbestrol? For those of you who aren't, briefly, the now infamous drug, DES, was invented by a British scientist, Charles Edward Dodds, in 1938. British custom at the time prohibited patenting certain drugs, so when Dodds published the results of his work in Nature that year, the chemical formula was free for the taking by any drug company anywhere. In the US, hundreds of companies started churning out this cheap yet very powerful compound that chemically bore a strong resemblance to DDT. No one, including its inventor, knew why DES imitated the effects of estrogen in a woman's body, but it did. Eli Lilly eventually became one of the largest producers of the drug. And within a few years, DES was used to prevent lactation in new mothers, to fatten cows and chickens before they were slaughtered, to combat advanced breast and prostate cancer. And after experimentation on a few dozen pregnant women by a husband and wife team at Harvard to prevent miscarriage. The only problem was the Harvard team's research was flawed, and it turned out that DES did not prevent miscarriage. Worse, in the early 1970s, the drug was found to have caused devastating cancers in some of the female offspring who were exposed before birth. A small number, but it sounded an alarm. A few years later, the DES legacy among those exposed in utero included reproductive abnormalities that led to miscarriage, ironically, or infertility. Sons of women treated in pregnancy also developed reproductive problems. It's estimated that about 5 million women were treated with this drug during their pregnancies. And now researchers believe that the problems unfortunately don't end with their sons and daughters, but extend to their grandchildren as well. Among the many uses physicians found in the late 1940s for this powerful drug was its ability, when given in high doses to young girls, to push their bodies into puberty earlier and through puberty faster, thereby giving them less time to grow as tall as they might otherwise. And by high doses, I'm talking about 100 times the amount of estrogen delivered in a high-dose birth control pill. Girls usually took the pills every day for at least 2 years, sometimes longer if they could stand the side effects, which, believe me, were not great. Physicians who treated a few girls at Massachusetts General and a few other places around the country began writing up the results for medical journals in the early 1950s. And as word got out, the doctors experimenting with this new drug treatment had plenty of customers. In the 1950s, some parents, usually mothers, many of whom had been tall girls and had suffered teasing about their height and remembered the embarrassment at school dances when nobody asked them to dance, were desperate to save their daughters from the same fate. At first, too tall meant taller than 5'8". Over time, the desired height limit rose. In the 60s, parents feared their girls growing taller than 5'10". In the 70s and 80s, they begged doctors to keep them at least under 6 feet. So the question you might ask is why parents would consider giving their healthy daughters such powerful drugs in order to cut their mature height. For one thing, they trusted their doctors, and while some pediatric endocrinologists refused to give girls a drug that early on raised the suspicions for some about its safety, mothers who were especially anxious about their daughters not fitting in, being teased, and dying an old maid would keep searching for a doctor who would prescribe. Being very tall might not be a disease, but one doctor at Massachusetts General told me, and he had treated hundreds of tall girls there, that he believed treating a girl's unhappiness and despair about her height was the same as treating disease. And the attitude among many of the mothers was, if the doctor was willing to treat, then it must be okay, because in those days doctors were like gods, basically infallible in the eyes of their patients. If treating healthy girls with massive amounts of synthetic estrogen sounds ridiculous today, it's important to remember how much our culture has changed in 50 years. Why did they do it? I'm going to try to find a slide and show you. Not that one. That one. What is wrong with this picture? And these. If you don't know, in real life, Ingrid Bergman was 5 foot 9.5 inches in bare feet. Humphrey Bogart was substantially shorter. But Hollywood routinely disguised the height of its stars by having Bergman or Sophia Loren or a host of other tall actresses stand in trenches in their bare feet while their shorter male co-stars stood on catwalks with lifts in their shoes, as was done for these studio photos. It was inconceivable that a female actress would loom over her romantic lead. And as far as Hollywood is concerned, it's still pretty inconceivable. When Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman divorced a few years ago, she famously said, "Well, at least now I can wear heels again." So Hollywood perhaps has something to answer for, and I do hope I haven't completely ruined your future viewing experience of Casablanca. The idea of the taller male, shorter female has been around longer than Hollywood, dating back perhaps to the days of our primitive ancestors. But our popular culture didn't help either. An article in a 1942 issue of Parents magazine read in part, I'm quoting here, "Tallness can be a real handicap for a girl. Protruding teeth in the tall girl can get to feel like elephant tusks, while a pair of stubbed and run-over size 7s," she's talking about shoes, and I think I was a size 7 when I was about 7, "look like the SS Normandy in her present unfortunate state." The writer advised parents to find a good dancing teacher for their tall daughters. Quote, "Extra inches," she wrote, "means she must have superior technique." The same article went on to say, quote, "She may find release in athletics if only she doesn't turn into an Amazon trying to beat the boys at their own games, and in this way make up for the fact that she lacks the ability to be normally feminine." Reading this, what parent wouldn't be worried? So parents who wanted the best for their daughters had reason to be concerned based on the social and cultural mores of the times. Middle-class women in those days were expected to marry and raise children. Stints as school teachers, nurses, or secretaries were okay, but ultimately a woman was expected to settle down with a man taller than herself and raise a family. Parents worried when their daughters began growing so tall that the odds of finding an appropriately sized suitor began to diminish with each additional half inch. And a parent's anxiety, of course, rubbed off on a child. In the early 1950s, this advice by a Dr. Walter Alvarez of the Mayo Clinic was published in the Los Angeles Times. In response to a request from a parent worried about her tall daughter, he wrote, quote, "I'm sorry to say that I know of no drugs which could safely be used to stop the girl from growing tall. If I had a granddaughter who was growing rapidly and threatening to qualify for the Los Angeles 6-footer Girls Club, I would suggest she be fed enough for health, but not much more than enough for that. And I would suggest that she not be stuffed with vitamins because some of them are stimulators of growth." Well, perhaps Dr. Alvarez didn't know that pills were already available to stunt the height of young women, or perhaps he was more prescient about their safety. But parents were already beginning to beat a path to the doors of doctors like John Crawford at Massachusetts General. He said mothers would fly in from all over the country with daughters in tow. Still, the treatment did not receive much attention outside medical journals. But in 1956, along with the girls and their mothers, came an Australian pediatrician who would become the leading proponent, a leading expert in using estrogen to stunt the height of tall girls. Dr. Norman Wettenhall, who became his country's first pediatric endocrinologist, studied with Dr. Crawford at Mass General, and a year or so later returned to Australia with the idea of carrying the research of stunting tall girls with estrogen to a higher level. He wanted to ascertain exactly how many inches he could slice off the final mature height of his patients. Over the next 10 or 15 years, he would treat hundreds of girls and publish his findings regularly in medical journals. The treatment spread around the world. In the 50s and 60s, girls who wanted to be ballet dancers, and it seems like there may have been quite a few of them because several journal articles reference them, could apparently be no taller than 5'6". The reason being that in toe shoes and on point, they gained an additional 6 inches. And unlike Hollywood, where a short actor could stand on a crate, a male dancer could not. If a pill could solve the problem, why not? Then, too, the darker side of drugs was not the issue that it has become today. The other glamorous career for girls in those days was that of airline stewardess, and there were strict height as well as weight and marital restrictions for those jobs. So pediatric endocrinologists, still a young specialty in the 60s and 70s, found their waiting rooms beginning to fill with perfectly healthy girls who may have dreamed about becoming ballerinas or stewardesses, and their anxious mothers who dreamed about their tall daughters finding husbands. But cultures change, and as anyone who lived through the 60s and 70s can tell you, they can change quickly and dramatically. In 1970, when Melbourne pediatric endocrinologist Norman Wettenhall was busy giving DES to hundreds of tall girls, another Melbourne native, a tall redhead, Germaine Greer, published her revolutionary book, The Female Eunuch. That same year, a female jockey rode in the Kentucky Derby for the first time. The next year, Ms. Magazine hit the newsstands with its first issues. Height and weight requirements for police and fire departments, the military, were adjusted to allow women to compete for those jobs, while men were allowed to become flight attendants. Suddenly, height restrictions started to disappear entirely. But perhaps the most important event occurred in 1972, and that was the passage of Title IX, which banned sex discrimination in schools. It had a profound effect on sports programs for women. In 1971, the number of women involved in collegiate sports in the U.S. was 29,977. 3 decades later, that number had grown to just under 3 million. It also had a very beneficial effect for tall girls. Suddenly, their height was an advantage on volleyball and basketball courts. Try to do this again. There we go. You may know her. Still, despite the revelations about DES in 1971 and the changing social scene, pediatric endocrinologists, and in some cases pediatricians, gynecologists, and internists, soldiered on in response to the requests of worried mothers. In response to bad news about DES, they switched their young patients to Premarin, which is an estrogen made from the urine of pregnant mares, or ethinyl estradiol. Then in 1977, following a couple of lengthy and critical stories in the New York Times about these estrogen treatments, a conference of pediatric endocrinologists was held to discuss concerns about their use and their long-term side effects. The conference concluded, and in a special supplement to the journal Pediatrics, the conferees wrote that since the treatment was undertaken for psychosocial reasons, it was, quote, imperative to evaluate the psychosocial benefit of treatment versus no treatment. They also recommended long-term follow-up of girls who had been treated and suggested the follow-up should consist of endometrial biopsies as well as liver function tests and cytology of the vagina. But nobody really followed up any of the girls as they aged, married, moved away, and no longer had any reason to see a pediatrician or a pediatric endocrinologist. Nobody knew how many girls had been treated. In many cases, the doctors they consulted as adults had never even heard of this treatment. And despite the advice coming out of the 1977 conference, nobody evaluated how well the treatment worked from a psychosocial standpoint. until about a quarter century later. In the late 90s, a group of Australian women who were treated as girls pressed their national government to follow up. An epidemiologist was hired and a group of researchers went to work tracking down women who had been patients of Dr. Wettenhall years earlier. And he very graciously opened up his files to the researchers, and he had kept excellent records over the years. Several years later, the researchers determined that the treatment had affected the women's fertility. Those treated had a harder time getting pregnant than a control group of women who had been assessed for treatment by the same doctor, but for whatever reasons had chosen against treatment and had not taken the synthetic estrogens. They also found that predicted heights of the girls who were to undergo the treatment were often inflated, not on purpose, but as a result of the inexact nature of predicting a child's mature height. The same researchers also looked for the first time at the psychosocial consequences of the treatment and were surprised to find that the cohort of treated women were far less happy with their final mature height than the untreated group, even though the untreated women ended up a tiny bit taller. Moreover, while some women were happy they had been given the drugs and believed, perhaps erroneously, that they had been spared several additional inches, a greater number were unhappy and actually angry. The reasons varied from fears about developing more health problems as they aged. By then, they were aware of the problems DES had caused in pregnant women, and there was increasing bad news about the negative effects of estrogen, such as hormone replacement therapy. Some were simply disappointed with the results. Despite taking the pills every day, dealing with the side effects, they were still quite tall. So after more than 30 years of treating tall girls with estrogen to stunt their growth, we find that it likely caused more harm than good. Had it not been for cultural changes, we might still be trying to shorten more of our tall girls, and in some countries they still do. A pediatric endocrinologist in the Netherlands, whose population is the tallest in the world, said the reason they still had a fair number of girls seeking treatment might be because they don't have women's basketball. In any case, treatment is rarer and rarer in this country. Not so for treating short boys. It's perhaps not likely that the culture will change in ways that make it easy to be a short man. On the other hand, let's go back to Hollywood. Look what's happened to James Bond. The first 5 were all over 6 feet, but the new 007 is only 5'10". Estrogen and growth hormone treatments have been done with the justification that being taller or shorter might bring our children more happiness and success. In other words, a medical solution to a social problem. Yet as parents try to look into the future for their children, perhaps the strongest lesson emerges. It's difficult to be a parent, and one of the largest difficulties is finding the line between accepting your children for whom they are and helping them become people others will accept and admire in a culture that seems to be ever-changing. None of us has a crystal ball. As the age of genetic medicine inevitably offers us more cures, who will define what is normal and what is not? Who is healthy and who is sick? Will doctors be complicit in reinforcing stigma, or will they contribute to a wider acceptance of variation in human beings? Will those of us who are parents and medical consumers urge caution and humility, or give in to pressures to make our children closer to whatever is deemed perfect that decade, that generation? The history of attempts to modify height is worth considering. The pace of technology will pick up. The temptations are only beginning. Thank you, and now we invite you to ask us some questions.
Please raise your hand if you have a question and identify yourself, and I will come to you with a microphone.
I've subcontracted this part out.
Do you have a question? Just have a comment. Yeah, just please identify yourself for the tape.
I'm Dr. Dan Moore, retired from the Department of Internal Medicine. In 1974, I took a sabbatical in Australia, in Melbourne, and we at that time had two older daughters who were in their late teens, and they were about 5'10". And then we had one younger daughter who was 14 at the time. And my wife was concerned. I'm 6'4", and I have a brother that's 6'5". And she thought maybe this daughter, and there was a lot of talk about it, as you all have described, that she might be unusually tall. Well, it so happens that Dr. Blizzard, who's here today, and may want to comment about this, we talked to him about it some, and he said, well, he had a good friend in Australia, Dr. Wettenall, who was interested in that. And so we decided at least to get an evaluation. And so our younger teenage daughter was evaluated. And fortunately, the prediction was that she would not be unusually tall, and he did not recommend any hormone treatment. So we did not do it. And she ended up being about 5'10" also, and it was fine. But I know Dr. Blizzard, who's here today, he may want to comment about the whole business because he was very much involved in this era.
Get the mic.
First of all, I congratulate you on writing information that needs to be brought to the attention of physicians and young people and parents and so forth and so on. If one goes back in history, it is of interest that everything that was done in the best interests of the patients. And I think today the same thing ordinarily applies, with a few exceptions of physicians who, like the exceptions in all sorts of fields, you know, we always have exceptions to what we want people to be, and no matter what profession they are. But I think your book does a very good job of making people more cautious. And your research is very thorough. It is very scientific in its approach. And what I'm speaking about is you have the data. So I commend you for all that. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned, though, is how industry gets tied up with the medical profession. And in the early 1970s, there was a repression, and Ronald Reagan decided that the way that could be in part handled, and in other words, the government cut way back on the amount of money that was being given for research in various ways. And he very much encouraged the doctors and industry to get together. And it was a big stimulus for lots of reasons. So a lot of the things that you see about collaboration between doctors and medical firms is attributable to that. And it's interesting, what goes around comes around. And what I'm speaking about is that right now there is almost a standoff, and again, government imposed in part, but also somewhat self-imposed, that there should not be any kind of official relationship between industry and physicians. I just give that as a point of history, because I think a lot of things that happened in the 70s and the 80s between industry and physicians is attributable there. I'm talking too long, but I've said...
Thank you very much for those comments, and of course, we really appreciate them coming from you. You certainly are a pioneer. One of the reasons we wrote the book was because so much information on this cannot be divided, cannot be separated out from industry, that people who thought that they were getting unbiased information, whether it was from the doctors or from the patient advocacy groups, much of it actually stemmed from the companies, the manufacturers themselves. And I think besides the direct involvement with research, there was also tremendous involvement with continuing medical education, in which the risks were downplayed and the benefits were perhaps exaggerated, and then influenced through these parent groups who were largely funded by manufacturers. And I think also influence of departments, academic departments, who, you know, if they were large prescribers, would get generous amounts of money from companies to fund medical fellows that they maybe not otherwise could not afford to fund. And as you point out, some of that's being untangled now, and it's maybe going the other direction a little bit.
My name is Al Rogel, and in full disclosure, I was on the other side.
I thought you looked familiar.
I was on the other side of that split screen on Nancy Snyderman's very quick TV show. Also, in full disclosure, it is me on page 178 of your book, which I'm going to ask you to sign for me. I just have one comment and perhaps one technical question. The comment is, I can't reiterate enough that the biggest side effect of both of these drugs is exactly the same: unmet expectations. And that is so key. And it leads me to my second point, and that is what concerns me about how epidemiology studies, how journalists put things together, and we as physicians, we take care of individual patients. What's average is absolutely no meaning at all. You have a patient in front of you. He got it or he don't got it. It's 100% for that individual. And so if we look at these statistically, I am absolutely certain you're correct about most of the things, but there are, in fact, individuals that we see, whether it's commonly or uncommonly, that are just make them a little bit different than everybody else. And so, as you do the calculus for this, it may lean in one direction or the other.
Yes, thank you for making that point. I mean, we are careful to state at the beginning of this book, we don't discourage parents from taking their kids in to have their growth monitored. We think some parents have very, very difficult decisions to make about their children. And of course, bioethicists aren't in the examining room with the doctors. It has to be very individual. I think our point is, the broader point is that everybody brings some assumptions into that examining room. The doctors come with their assumptions, the families come with theirs about what this means for the future life of their child, and there are many more incentives on the treatment side than on the follow-up side to find out what the real impact of either treating or not treating is.
Indeed. And it can't be any different from your point of view either.
Christine.
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah. I think with the tall girls, it's a longer story and it's sort of over. I mean, there's very little. I do hear every so often, I'll get a phone call from a father who says, I understand you know about this treatment. My wife really wants our daughter, who's 6 feet tall, to have this treatment. What do you think we should do? I said, well, I'm not really a doctor, but think about it carefully and maybe talk to a psychologist and see how much it's really bothering the daughter. And in fact, in our book, we spend some time describing a visit to a growth clinic in Buffalo and watching how David Sandberg, who has been making the point for a number of years that some of these kids,
He's a psychologist.
he is a psychologist, what they really need is some psychological help to deal with, maybe it's the teasing that's happening at school, and certainly giving kids a shot every day for a couple of years isn't going to help the teasing. Sorry about that. It's not going to help the teasing. That won't stop the teasing.
In their diet.
Yeah. Was there another question? Yeah.
Great job. My name is Matthew Thomas. I'm a genetic counselor in pediatrics. We take care of a good number of patients that have hereditary disorders or genetic disorders that predispose them to have short stature, something like Turner syndrome.
Yes.
And what I was wondering is, because you guys are speaking more to the general population of just short kids that are short just because they're short, how do insurance companies play a role in this? Because $70,000, for an inch or whatever the payment, we know it's expensive, and we go through insurance pre-authorizations for our children that have hereditary conditions, and they usually cover those. But what happens when it's just idiopathic?
Well, I can start by saying we were at a conference a few years ago where there was actually advice being given out to parents about how, by drug companies, about how to get the insurance companies to cooperate with this treatment. Now that was several years ago. Maybe the insurance companies have kind of figured out a little bit better about.
The insurance companies are the one, they're the real gatekeepers, aren't they? By the way, we do have a section on Turner syndrome and how that was kind of the wedge in the door to get, because girls with Turner syndromes have normal levels of growth hormone. For those who don't know about it, these are girls with a chromosomal inheritance that one of the effects is that they usually end up under 5 feet. But they do have normal hormone levels, and therefore when the companies came to ask for permission to market this to other kids with normal growth hormone levels, this was a precedent already set. Yes, the insurance companies, one of them at this conference we were at, one of their selling points was that they had 4 nurses on staff who worked exclusively on the insurance companies. And often what they would do is the companies would give families a free trial for 6 months or so, and in the meantime, and then they document that it boosted growth, which it does I think the doctors can correct me, in most cases it does boost the growth rate in the first 6 months anyway, unless somebody has a resistance to it. And then the insurance companies would go ahead and pay for it. My sense, and this is just completely anecdotal, is that once the market was expanded to potentially 1 million or 1.7 million, the insurance companies sort of went, whoa, and an unfortunate effect was that kids who actually were deficient, those families started to have more trouble getting coverage. The insurance companies got very much more picky about it. But I guess the question is, do we really want the insurance companies to be the gatekeepers here?
And I think, on the other side of this, there are probably plenty of kids out there who need help, who have real problems, but they are not making their way to growth clinics. Their parents don't have the wherewithal or whatever. So there's a large group out there that probably could use some of these drugs, but nobody even knows they're there. It's just this whole odd healthcare climate that we're in, where it's the squeaky wheel, I guess.
Last chance. Anyone else want to ask one more question? We have time for one. Well,
Thank you all for coming to Medical Center Hour this year. Thank you very much to our speakers, Susan Cohen and Christine Cosgrove. I do encourage you, those who haven't already bought the book and want an autograph, the rest should go. It's a really, it's a good read, and it's one that after you read it will cause you to think. I promise you that. So anyway, thank you. See you next year.
Thank you.